Well, Lebanon's capital saw its most violent day since anti-establishment protests began. Sirens rang out across Beirut on Saturday. Over 200 were injured in the clashes. Anger is boiling over. The unprecedented protest movement has rocked the country since October. For more, let's speak to Layla Molana-Allen in Beirut. Layla, tell us more about the clashes we saw in downtown Beirut on Saturday.
We did see the greatest level of violence that we've seen in these protests since they started in the middle of October yesterday. All week this had been building up. Protesters said on Tuesday they were launching a week of rage in reaction to the fact that a government still hasn't been formed in the country yet. And so we saw throughout the week the smashing of banks, we saw lots of fiery roadblocks. And yesterday, the day started off quite quietly. And then a group of protesters decided they were going to try and get into Parliament Square. Now, that square has been blocked off by riot police pretty much since the beginning of those protests, blocked off with barbed wire and permanent metal barricades, and there are riot police staffing it all day. And when that happened, almost immediately riot police responded by firing water cannon at them. Now, that's been quite rare as a reaction in these protests, and that angered protesters who say, of course, that Parliament belongs to us and the politicians aren't using it as they should. That's their argument. And so many more gathered, and they kept trying to get in. From that point on, this was about 5 p.m. yesterday, the violence really escalated. We saw an enormous amount of tear gas shot, clouds of it all over downtown Beirut for 4 or 5 hours as clashes continued yesterday. And one of the things that's been happening now is that those riot police are not using the tear gas correctly. And there's many images yesterday of them actually shooting tear gas canisters directly at protesters. Now, that is illegal under international law, if that can be proven. Human Rights Watch is looking into it at the moment because, of course, if those canisters are fired directly rather than into the air, the actual canister becomes a weapon. And many injuries caused by those canisters yesterday. Also, rubber bullets were being used as well, and many injuries from those as they were being fired point blank, sometimes at people running away, very bloody injuries, people's mouths bleeding. One person may have lost their sight. They're in hospital today. So really a huge escalation in injuries. The Lebanese Red Cross was at its highest level of alert all night. They said that they treated 140 people at the scene and transported 80 of those people to hospital. So many injuries resulting. Also many injuries on the side of the riot police. And it really was an ongoing battle all around downtown Beirut last night. Usually we have been seeing isolated clashes in certain areas and then they calm down. But last night just kept going, and huge rage from protesters. They say that they are going to gather again today from 11 a.m. at Parliament Square to show the government and the riot police that they're not going anywhere. We'll see whether that happens or whether they're cowed by what happened yesterday.
Now, Lila, you've been covering this grassroots movement since it began, and you've seen how it's been born, grown, and evolved over time. Tell us why the protesters are protesting as they are.
So there are a few reasons. Of course, these protests started as anti the current government, anti-corruption, anti what the protesters see as the political establishment made up of the elites that doesn't really represent the country. And since the 29th of October, there hasn't been a proper government in the country. It's been a caretaker government since the former Prime Minister Saad Hariri resigned. And then finally, on the 17th of December, a new Prime Minister, Hassan Diab, was nominated, and he still hasn't formed a new government. He said he'd do it within a month. That fell on Friday. We were promised a government. They came out the day before saying that there would be a new cabinet, and at the last minute, political wrangling meant it didn't happen once again. So protesters very angry as what they see as yet more government inefficiency. And while that's been happening, this huge economic crisis that Lebanon is suffering that started before the protests has been ongoing and getting worse and worse. We've seen 35 to 40% rise in inflation in just 3 months. That directly translates into people's shopping baskets. Prices have gone up hugely at a time when people are losing their jobs. Many people either having their hours cut or losing their jobs altogether. So people really cannot survive. They can't pay their rent. They can't pay to heat their houses. At the moment, it's very cold in Lebanon. People really suffering. And so, of course, they see that the politicians, from their point of view, are simply playing games to try and win points in forming this new cabinet rather than what they want, which is an emergency government to deal with these problems. And then, of course, finally, that's compounded by the fact that over the last week, we've seen an increase in the violence of the way that riot police are reacting to the protests, and government officials coming out. Many of them came out yesterday saying, we support the peaceful right to protest, but we're calling on the riot police and the army to reinstall peace on the streets and stop people vandalizing. Protesters saying, from our point of view, these security forces are supposed to be there to protect us and our country, and they're actually now fighting against us, fighting for these politicians who we do not believe represent us against their own people. So all those different factors are coming together to make people angrier and angrier as they believe their government is doing nothing to solve the problems that they're suffering in the country.
All right. Thank you very much, Leila. Leila Molana-Allen reporting in Beirut.